Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see so many of you here, and delighted to welcome today Andrea Freund, who many of you will know well, I'm sure. She has just recently completed a PhD at the Institute for Northern Studies here in Kirkwall. Her thesis was entitled Runic Writing in Orkney, Expressions of a Norse Identity. Now, she is currently living in Germany and has, for the last 2 terms, been teaching at the University of Oslo and teaching runology and Old Norse. So we're absolutely delighted to have her with us today. And I will pass the floor to her. So very welcome, Andrea.
Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you for having me for this talk. I'll just start sharing my slides, which you should hopefully see in a moment. Okay. Oisin, could you nod or so if you can see my slides? Very well. So, the title of today's talk is The World of Orcadian Runecarvers. It's very much based on my PhD, but I can only show you some glimpses and show you some thoughts. Obviously, the entire PhD was about 400 pages, so I'm not going to be able to show you everything, but we'll have a Q&A at the end, so you can ask more stuff. And I've also put my email address on the final slide. So if you have any burning questions, or if you're keen on reading 400 pages about runes, I'm very happy to share the thesis with you. So what am I going to talk about? These are some of the topics that I'm trying to cover. For some of you who may be very new to runes or who may not be so sure about what it is exactly, I'll give you a very, very short introduction. What are runes? And also what definition of runes am I using? Because if you Google runes, you'll find a lot of material, and not all of that conforms with the definition of runes that I work with. Then I'll give you a very brief introduction again into Orkney in the Viking Age and in the late Norse period, so the period that the inscriptions are from, because people are, well, hopefully dialing in from all over the world, so I don't know if you know a lot about Orcadian history. If you do, then, well, you'll have to listen anyway, sorry. And then we'll really get into detail. I'll show you some case studies of runic inscriptions in Orkney and from Orkney. And that distinction is because not all of these inscriptions are in Orkney nowadays. Some of the inscriptions are now in Edinburgh in the National Museum of Scotland. And then I will try and answer the question, what can these inscriptions tell us about the world the carvers lived in, and maybe even about the views of the carvers? Who were these people? So, the very, very short introduction. Basically, runes, the way I work with them, are a writing system. One rune represents approximately one sound in the language. In our case, we're talking about the Old Norse language, so the language that the Vikings were speaking. But runes were in use already way before the Viking Age, and they were developed in the late Roman period in northern continental Europe. And you'll find lots of different opinions where runes exactly came from, when exactly the system was developed, but I'm not going into this debate right now. They were in active use across northern Europe for over 1,000 years. So the period that we're talking about, the Viking Age and the late Norse period in Orkney, is only a relatively short period within the longer use of runes. And all in all, we know over 6,000 runic inscriptions at the moment, and every year new ones are found. And if you just want to have a little glimpse, you can, for instance, check the Scandinavian Runic database that has most of them. And yeah, again, I'll only talk about 50-ish or so. So just a tiny part of the world of runology. Now, how do I actually know that the inscriptions I talk about are from the Viking Age or from the late Norse period? Luckily, runes didn't stay exactly the same for 1,000 years. They changed. So by looking at the forms of the runes, the styles the carvers are using, also the styles of ornaments around the runes, the change in the language, we can be pretty confident about dating them. I mean, I can't tell you this inscription was made on Wednesday, the 5th of June, 951, but usually you can at least give a century and sometimes 2 or 3 decades from when an inscription comes. As for material, when you think about runes, most people will first think of rune stones, but actually most of the inscriptions I will talk about today are not rune stones at all. And in fact, we don't have a single complete runestone from Orkney that survives. We only have fragments of runestones, but we have lots of different materials that were carved in, and runes are very rarely used in manuscripts. We have some exceptions, but none from Orkney. So here's a little choice of materials that we can find runes carved in. On the top left, this is a piece of cattle rib. Very nice surface for writing because it's nice and flat. The upper middle image is a bear's tooth. And the upper right image is a Pictish brooch. So not the classic runestone experience, but really these are just as valid inscriptions as runestone inscriptions, and they're just as interesting. In the lower left corner, that's a steatite spindle whorl. The lower middle, not corner, the lower middle bit of the slide is a stone that was probably part of a church wall in Orkney when it was inscribed. So again, an inscription in stone, but not a classic runestone at all. And the lower right corner is a bone spindle whorl, a cattle femur head from Orkney, which is the most recent find we've had, only from 2017. Now, this is probably what you're thinking of when you're thinking runestones or runes in general, because these are probably the more famous inscriptions. And I just wanted to show them because we have nothing like it in Orkney at all. We don't have anything that's as long as the Rökstone, the middle inscription. In fact, the Rökstone alone has more runes than we have from all of Orkney, and yet I'm claiming that the Orcadian corpus is just as interesting and can tell us just as much. On the left, we have golden horns. They're actually replicas because the original golden horns were stolen and molten down. Again, we don't have anything that's as intricate as this or as monetary valuable as this. But the Orcadian inscriptions are just as exciting as the golden horns. And then on the right hand, we have wooden sticks from Bergen in Norway. And I've put them there because these are always used as arguments that, well, in Bergen, we have these hundreds and hundreds of wooden sticks, so people were so literate and everyone knew runes. And in Orkney, we don't have any wooden sticks. But if you know Orkney, wood is really hard to come by. There are very few trees. So maybe it's not the lack of literacy, but just the lack of material to write on. Also, the conditions in the Orcadian soil are very different. So if there were wooden sticks, they would probably not have survived over a few centuries. So this is all what we're going to not see so much. Now, for dating Orcadian inscriptions, these are the 2 rune rows that most people will know, the older or elder Futhark and the younger or Viking Age Futhark. Luckily, the Vikings only came to Orkney after runes had switched to Viking Age runes, so that already helps us in dating because we find only the younger Futhark and later runes. So we already know it must be after about 750. But then something else happens, because you can see here from the older to the younger runes, some runes are just dropped. And I said a few slides ago that every rune is roughly a sound in the language. But the language didn't just randomly lose lots of sounds. And you see now in the younger Futhark, a lot of runes suddenly have to stand in for 2, 3, or even 5 different sounds, which doesn't make it very practical in reading. So the Norse had this amazing idea for writing. We don't exactly know whose idea it was or where it originated, but to distinguish different sounds represented by the same rune, you just put a dot. Now, I'm German, so for me, this is an absolutely logical choice. But in the Middle Ages, this was an amazing idea, and it was absolutely groundbreaking. And again, it helps us in dating. If an inscription has dots, it's probably later than an inscription that does not use dots. Not always, but as a rough rule. So in Orkney, we have younger Futhark inscriptions, and we have some with dotted runes, so we have a pretty good idea how to date all our inscriptions. When it comes to types of inscriptions, we have a huge range. Classically, we always think of memorial inscriptions, but actually, because we only have fragments in Orkney, there are only two where we can say, yeah, these were probably memorial inscriptions. Most others weren't. We can have the owners or the makers' names, and we have quite a number of inscriptions that are just so-and-so carved these runes. We can have pragmatic messages. I just showed you the sticks from Bergen. These are probably the most famous examples of just almost like shopping lists on runes, on rune sticks. We don't have those from Orkney at the moment, but I'll show you some candidates for these in a moment. You can have prayers and you can have curses in runes, and we also have prayer inscriptions from Orkney, and maybe, just maybe, a curse, but that's very debatable. You can have graffiti, and they can be very rude. Think of modern day toilet cubicle graffiti, and you know roughly the register at which these graffiti feature. And we have a lot of graffiti in Orkney. And then there is always the question of magic. Do we have magic spells in runes? And that's really difficult, because there used to be a tendency to interpret everything that couldn't be interpreted by modern means as magic. Nowadays, we're not so sure anymore. And it does appear that first and foremost, runes were a writing system, phonetic, where one rune is one sound. And the runes per se were not magic. But, of course, you can write a magic spell with runes. You can write anything in runes. So we could have magic in runes, but at the moment there isn't really a good candidate in Orkney for that type of inscription. Now, in terms of information, if I want to use these inscriptions as sources to find out about the people, of course, I first of all need to think, what can I read out of these inscriptions, and what can I not find out from these inscriptions? And there are two different angles I can come at this. I could, first of all, look at only the inscription, or look at information that's given within the inscription itself. And then I could, of course, look at what does the entire object and what does the context tell me. So here in the picture, you can see a runic inscription from Orkney. It's actually number 23. And that's a quite interesting one because it's in Latin and it gives a part of the Lord's Prayer. So, of course, I can find out the date, or at least the period, within the inscription itself. I can just look at the runes and give you a rough date for it. This one, probably early 12th, mid-12th century. I can look at the language. Now, and this one is Latin, so that's interesting in itself, because you'd more expect the inscription to be in Old Norse, but we have a number of Latin examples from Orkney, from Norway. The spelling, and this one is quite fascinating already, because the Latin is not spelled the way Latin should be spelled, or Latin would be spelled, and there the carver already ran into a big problem, because there is no C in runes, and in Latin you need a C a lot. So the carver just used the runes for T and S for the T sound. So that already tells us that the carver probably wasn't as literate in Latin, but were pretty good at using runes to write down the spoken Latin that they had maybe heard in church. We can look at the type of runes, and we have some runes that are more connected to certain areas. Now this one doesn't really have any very diagnostic types, but it is short twig runes, and they fit within Orkney. So from that one, we can't really say that, oh, that must have been a carver who traveled or so. And we can look at the content. Now, this is the Lord's Prayer, or a part of it, and that already tells us that the carver was most probably Christian. Now, that's not very surprising in early 12th century Orkney. It would have been more surprising if the carver had not been a Christian, but in other inscriptions, the content can be very informative for us. Now, of course, there's more information from outwith a runic inscription. This is an image from Orkney again, the bear's tooth from the Brough of Birsay, which also has a hole drilled in, and it's the only such object that we have in the entire Western Sea, but we have some in mainland Scandinavia. And this one has the first runes in the rune row, food dark, so it's not actually, there isn't any textual information in that, but of course we can look at the runes and say, yes, younger food dark, but for dating, it's not very helpful per se. But we can look at the decoration. So this one uses double lines. So it was probably supposed to be a decorative object. We can look at the material. Well, bear's tooth, that's pretty rare because at the time that the Norse settled in Orkney, bears had been extinct there for a few centuries, while in Scandinavia, of course, we still have bears. So this object appears to have traveled. The context. Now this find was made a number of decades ago, and not much about the context was recorded in great detail, but it does appear to have come from a building context on the Brough of Birsay, which we know was one of the earlier Norse settlements and was in use for a few centuries. And the problem is that it was in a relatively early building, but there was a later wall that came through. So it could be from either of these, and we don't really know. Now, when we look at the find spot, if we know where the find spot is, we can look at the place name. The Brough of Birsay, of course, is this tidal island just off the northwest corner of the Orkney mainland. And Birsay comes from Birgis Herad or Birgis A. It's either a Birgis district or Birgis Island. And already that name, giving its name to an entire area, tells us that this was probably a seat of power. In Orkney, we have other place names where this is even more explicit. And in my study, in my longer PhD, if you read through all the 400 pages, you'll find that we get runic inscriptions, particularly at places that indicate a very high status. We can look at all the archaeology. We can look at what else was in the area. And interestingly, on the Brough of Birsay, we also have a memorial runestone. We also have a Pictish symbol stone. So it's a very rich area when it comes to finds in general. We can try and find out if it's a primary or a secondary location. So for instance, if we have a runestone, does it still stand where it was meant to stand? Or was it reused as the foundation for a building or so? And that tells us a lot about the history of the runic artifact in itself and how people saw the runestone maybe a few decades after it was erected. So now a little bit about the Norse in Scotland. Why do we actually have runic inscriptions in Orkney? Well, it's all the Vikings' fault, basically. I have given you here two maps. Because they show pretty well why we have runes where we have them. You can see both when you look at Viking funerals and when you look at the later Norse kingdoms of Man and the Isles and the earldom of Orkney and Shetland. These tie in pretty well with the areas of Norse settlement in the Western Sea. So now the next few maps. Where I have mapped out runic inscriptions, and on the right-hand side, Barbara Crawford has mapped out Norse place names in Scotland, and you see this all ties in really well. So wherever the Norse settled, we can expect to find runic inscriptions just as well. And you can see the density is in both place names and runic inscriptions is by far the highest in Orkney. And that's the case for really all of Scotland. Shetland has a few, but unfortunately I had to cut it off the map. But Shetland has way fewer inscriptions than Orkney. So when we look at Scandinavian runic inscriptions in Scotland, now not Anglo-Saxon runic inscriptions, of which we have a few in the Scottish Borders region, the number, fortunately or unfortunately, is fluctuating all the time. We have some exciting new finds every few years, but sometimes we also find that an inscription that was part of our corpus actually turns out to be modern, and then it has to be struck off the corpus list. At the moment, it's pretty clear the largest corpus by far is Orkney. We have 56, but 33 of them are inside the Neolithic tomb of Maeshowe, and I'll come back to Maeshowe in a few slides. As I said, Shetland doesn't quite have so many, only 7. Caithness has 2, and the rest of Scotland, mostly the western seaboard, has 13. Now, for comparison, England, even though the Danelaw was densely settled for centuries by, well, Norse-speaking people, only has 19. And Wales, which never really was settled thoroughly by the Norse, as far as we think now, has not a single one. So what did the Norse actually do in Orkney? That's a way more complicated question to answer than I can do in this talk. So this is really the very short, summary. The date when the first Norse settler set foot on Orkney is unfortunately unclear. If we follow Orkney saga, it was probably in 875, but if we follow the archaeology, we don't really have any evidence for such early settlement. It is well possible that already during the first raiding phases in the Irish Sea, Orkney was used as a base because it is much closer to the Irish Sea and striking distance to all the rich monasteries than Norway. But a raiding base, per definition, is a temporary thing, so you can't really see it well in archaeology. But what we do know is that either in the late 9th or in the late 10th century, the Earldom of Orkney, which over time also encompassed Shetland, Caithness, and Sutherland, and at some points even some of the Hebridean islands, comes under Norwegian overlordship. And in the 12th century, we really have what's called the golden age of the Earldom. We have its own saint, St. Magnus, and later also St. Rungvad. We have the building of St. Magnus Cathedral. We have Norse poetry, and it's really one of the major power players in the entire Norse realm. However, it's also really close to the Scottish crown, and we have some intermarriage also between Orcadian, the Earldom family in Orkney, and Scottish nobles. So there are very often power struggles in this triangle, and that leads eventually first to the loss of taxation rights in Shetland, because the Orcadian earls side with the wrong pretender to the Norwegian crown. And then it leads to a decline of Norwegian power from about the 13th century onwards. They lose Caithness, they lose the Western Isles, and in 1468, the entire Earldom of Orkney becomes Scottish, and it still is now. So really, the period that we should expect to find runes from is either the late 9th or the late 10th century to the end of the 12th century, because that's the peak of Norse power in Orkney. And indeed, if we look at the runes, the dates fit in pretty well with what we are led to expect. And also it's very interesting when you map out where we find inscriptions in Orkney. Now the red dots are inscriptions in stone, which you can expect to have been made pretty much where they're found or relatively close to it. And the blue ones are portable objects. We see there is not just one site or two sites, but they really spread out pretty well across a number of islands. And the Caithness ones are really seem to belong to this kind of cluster of inscriptions in Orkney and Shetland, and not so much with the Western Isles of Scotland. So we have something pretty dense in runic inscriptions here. As I said, at the moment we have 56, but this number could really change any given day if someone walks across a beach and finds something. 33 inside Maeshowe, and we have 3 that unfortunately were lost from the corpus because they turned out to be modern, or most probably modern. And the inscriptions do cover the entire date range of Norse Orkney, but the ones that we can date most closely are all from the 12th century. And as I said, we don't have a complete runestone, which is really sad for me, of course, but we have enough material to say, yes, there were once runestones standing in Orkney. We have some inscriptions that have complete sentences, or at least phrases, and we have some that there's no chance to interpret them at all. So really a wild bunch of material. And unfortunately, the corpus is now spread across a large number of locations. As I said earlier, some are now in Edinburgh, some are in the Orkney Museum, and some are still on site because obviously Maeshowe is World Cultural Heritage, and you can't really explain to UNESCO that the runic inscriptions are now struck off the walls of the tomb and put in a museum. But UNESCO wouldn't let you do this. Others are just not practical to remove. And one is currently on display in Scale House, for instance. So this is a graph I made for my thesis to visualize the dating ranges. The blue lines are where potential dates that we can make from, for instance, runestone style or archaeological context and so on. The sort of hazy ones are where we really have to apply some guesswork in terms of the dates, but you can see mid-12th century is a pretty well covered area in that. When you look at the material, yes, we do have over half of the material is stone, but we also have metal. We have one inscription in steatite, and that's interesting in itself because there is no steatite quarry from Norse Orkney, and that material looks to have been imported from Shetland. Now, unfortunately, we don't know if that object was inscribed in Shetland already or whether it came to Orkney and was inscribed there. But for now, because it was found in Orkney, it counts to the Orcadian corpus. And we have some on bone or tooth and antler. So really a pretty good mix of materials, and shows that maybe sometimes material choice was just pragmatic. You carved whatever you just had there. Now I want to show you some sites where runes were actually used in Orkney. This is the Brough of Birsay, a tidal island that can only be reached at a low tide on foot. And it was settled over, well, it was already a Pictish settlement, and it appears to have been one of the first sites that the Norse took over. We don't know by which processes. And that has both a formal runestone inscription, of which we now have 3 fragments, and it has the tooth. So quite fascinating. We also have another potential runestone bit that has a second runic inscription that was made later, and that just says Philippus carved these runes. So quite a fascinating site, and with evidence for runic literacy that covers at least a century. Another really important site, and I'll show you some inscriptions from that site in a moment, is Orphir, or the Earl's Boo. You can see here part of the church ruin, but Orphir was also one of the sites that was crucial to Norse Orkney over probably centuries. You will find it mentioned as the site of major events in Orkney saga. And even though I always say you have to be very careful using saga evidence in runology, this seems to be one of the seats of main power. And it also seems to be one of the main sites where we have good evidence for people being very literate. So this is the site where the stone with the Lord's Prayer in Latin probably originates from, even though it was found a few miles away, reused as building material. But we have a second stone that was probably part of the church wall here of the ruined church that mentions that, depending on how you read it, either this church is no good or no church is as good as this. And then we have a few bone pieces that I'll show you in a moment. Oops. And this is probably the most famous site of runic inscriptions that we have in Orkney. It's the Neolithic chamber tomb of Maeshowe. And that appears to have been broken into in the mid-12th century by a group of Norse, apparently both men and women, and they carved 33 distinct inscriptions. And these inscriptions even respond to each other. So people went into the tomb, read, oh, someone has written this, now I'm going to reply. And really almost every available surface is covered in runes. It's absolutely amazing. The site is also mentioned as Orkauger in the Orkney saga, and the same place name, Orkauger, is used in an actual inscription in there. So this is one of the rare events where the runic evidence ties in really well with the saga. And interestingly, of the 33 inscriptions inside Maeshowe, 6 mention women, and one even claims that it was a woman who carved it, and it's one of the most literate and most informative inscriptions in there. Now, what language do people actually speak? Most of the inscriptions where you can make out words are clearly in Old Norse, and those that have a slight dialectal variety all look to be West Norse. That's not very surprising because that was the variety of Old Norse that was spoken across the Western Ocean. Some traits are Icelandic, and I'll come back to Iceland in a moment. But the thing is that with only 56 inscriptions and no other surviving texts from that period, the corpus is too small to say whether there was any specific Orcadian variety or Orcadian dialect of Old Norse, unfortunately. Same goes, of course, for Caithness and Shetland, which have even fewer inscriptions. And Latin was the second most important language in Orkney at the time. It was the language of the church, and we do indeed have the stone with the Lord's Prayer from Nebestel, which is very clearly in Latin, but we also have another good candidate. It's this little tiny plaque from Quois in Dearness on the Orcadian mainland, and that could possibly be an attempt at writing Latin or garbled Latin, and the other side looks to be Old Norse. So a really fascinating mix of language of someone who was possibly bilingual at the time, and the Latin that may be on there could be a ban on something to do with anger, because you can read iras and abi. So abi is the imperative form, you can go away, and iras could come from ira, the Latin word for anger. And that appears to have been, that's not something that you'd hear in church or anything like that. So that would have been something that the carver would have come up with themselves. So that's a better written command of Latin than we have in phonetically spelling out the Lord's Prayer. But unless this amulet, well, I call it amulet, but we don't really know if it was meant to be an amulet, it seems quite likely, is unfolded and we can see what's inside, we can't really say for certain. But the problem is, this is absolutely tiny, it spent centuries in the soil. If you unfold it, it will break. So unless a new technology is found where you can kind of X-ray lead, which is not possible right now, we'll unfortunately never know what the inside says. Any guess is as good as mine. Now for names, I don't expect you to learn that list by heart or so. This is just a list I made, and I've put it on here to show you the wide variety and the huge number of people that we have evidence for in Orkney. So the top 6 inscriptions are from outside Maeshowe, and the others are all from inside Maeshowe, and a lot of people are named there. And if you go through the names, you'll find that, with some exceptions of biblical names, such as Philippus, they're all Old Norse. Now you say, of course, it's runes, it's Old Norse, but at the time we know, especially in the higher strata of society, there was a lot of intermarriage, so you'd also expect some people should maybe have Gallic names or Anglo-Saxon names or anything like that. There's nothing there, and that's quite interesting to me. But of course, what was it? Yeah. So names are obviously something that you are given by your parents and by society, but you can change them over time. Nowadays, of course, you have to do something official and so on. In the past, that wasn't necessary. If you decided, I'm now called whatever, something else, that was it. You just had to get people to call you that new name. And we do know of people that use 2 different names that could belong to 2 different spheres of their life. So maybe using the Norse part of your name or the Norse name was just the logical choice if you were writing in Norse, if you were writing runes. We don't know if all these people using Norse names really were Norse and really considered themselves completely Norse. Another interesting aspect that unfortunately remains a bit mysterious is bynames and nicknames. We have 4 examples. They're all from Maeshowe, but only one where we know pretty well what it means. And that's Arnfitr Matr, which is literally Arnfitr food. So maybe a chef, or maybe someone who was known to like to eat. The others are Otar Fila. We don't know what Fila means. One could be Ormr in Uri Ingi, something like that. Again, we don't really know what it means. And Hermunter Hardexi could be something to do with har, could be hard uxi, hard axe, but then we have another instance inside Maeshowe where the word for axe is spelled differently. So we really don't quite know. But it's interesting that the people decide to use these names, the nicknames, and not the father's name that you would normally be associated with. And that could be an instance where we can prove that the Maeshowe inscriptions were made for a kind of inner circle of people, not for everyone to know who made them. It's well possible that Ottar had a father's name, let's call him Ottar Jonsson, that everyone in society would have known, but that not everyone knew who Ottar Fila was, because that was just the nickname. So this is really a tactic that, of course, even nowadays, graffiti sprayers would still use, to use a nickname to distinguish between your inner circle and all the rest of the people. Now, for some joke. Admittedly, to modern ears, that joke is not extremely funny, but actually it's one of the funniest jokes we have in runes, I find. It's a bone from the Earl's Brew, the site with the church ruin that I just showed you. And it literally says this bone was in something, probably in meat. So as a runologist, you find this thing, I mean, I didn't find it, but the runologists who first looked at it, decipher it and think, yes, some grand discovery, and then all it tells you is that, yeah, this bone was in meat once. But when you think of it in a greater scheme, written jokes are really difficult to make. It's not the first thing you do when you learn to write. It's not something you ever do when you're a little bit insecure about your reading and writing. So this shows us that whoever made this was really, really, really literate. And generally, humor was really important in Norse society. As I said, written jokes, and we have some from Styx in Bergen, for instance, they're one of the most sophisticated forms of writing that you could possibly use. They show, of course, a high degree of literacy on side of the carver, but also the carver expects that whoever gets this bone will understand the joke. So the carver is confident that lots of people will also be able to read really well. And generally, in Norse literature, humor is really important. I mean, the final words of Ragnar Lodbrok's death song are literally, "Laughing shall I die." So you had to show humor to assert your status. So how literate were people in North Orkney really? We only have 56 inscriptions, so what you can say about general literacy is a bit limited. But on this photo, you can see 4 different bone pieces that were on an exhibition in the Orkney Museum last year. They're all from the Earl's Brough. And they are, interestingly, all have runes on them in at least 2 different handwritings. One carver carved the staves with 1 stroke of the knife. Another carver carved them with 2 parallel strokes. And you normally don't switch between different handwritings and runes like that. So we know that there were at least 2, probably more carvers. And also, they're all cattle bones, but different parts. They're ribs and scapulae, so shoulder blades, which means that it wasn't one piece of inscribed bone that was imported from somewhere else, but rather that these were inscribed on bones that were probably used for cooking, eating, on that site. So there were a number of highly literate people in the Earl's Brough at any given point. I haven't seen the current radiocarbon dates for the context this is from, but Colleen Beatty is currently writing up the site, so this will be published hopefully very, very soon. And then we'll have a better understanding of when exactly did these literate people visit or live at that site. But also Maeshowe, 33 inscriptions from a single site, that does indicate that there were a number of highly literate people there. So I hope this puts to bed the idea that medieval people or medieval Norse people just couldn't really read and write at all. Now, something that I'm very interested in is mental geography. So where did these people actually think they were? What did they think about their surroundings? And surprisingly, some inscriptions can give us a pretty good indication of that. This is the inscription called Orkney Barnes 20. It's inside Maeshowe, and on the image you can see just how faint some of these are, so relatively difficult to make out, but the runes are still pretty clear. And that inscription says in the translation of Michael Barnes, "The man who is most skilled in runes west of the ocean carved these runes with the axe which Gaukre Trandilssoner owned in the south of the country." So indeed, we have 2 clear geographic markers in this inscription, but not all is as it seems. When we talk about the south of the country, which country is actually meant by the word land? It's not really the south of Orkney, because there is only a few miles of south of Orkney if you look at Maeshowe. So that's not very logical. But it also doesn't appear to be Caithness. That's never called the land. And indeed, if you look in Norse literature, the south of the land is the south of Iceland. And that's where this phrase is usually used for. To indicate that Iceland is meant, if I just jump back, we also have the name dropping of Gaukre Trandilssoner, who happens to be an Icelandic saga hero with a very famous axe. So that also tells us that probably we should not take the axe too literally, and it's more a sort of the carver demonstrating that they know about Gaukre Trandilssoner and the axe, because if you look at that very faint inscription, that has not been carved using an axe. I can assure you of that. But then we also have west of the ocean. But if you're in Orkney, the ocean's all around you. So where exactly is west of the ocean, or seen from where? And that is still using the geography of the Norse homeland. If you look at Orkney, yes, the oceans all around. But if you look at Norway, the Western Sea is what we now call the North Sea in English, because from an English point of view, it's north, yes. But from a Norwegian point of view, the ocean is west. So west of that ocean is actually Orkney, is Shetland, is the Faroes, is Iceland. So quite an interesting twist in the geography, because it doesn't actually use Orkney as a point of reference for the mental geography at all. And then we have two markers of geography that seem at first sight really odd in a Neolithic tomb in Orkney in runes. The only place that's mentioned twice in the entire corpus is Jerusalem. So we have Orkney Barnes 14 that says Jerusalem men broke this mound, and Orkney Barnes 24, the one I mentioned earlier, the only one that is carved, clearly states that it's carved by a woman. Jerusalem travelers broke Orkau, so Maeshowe, leaves the Earl's housekeeper carved. So there seems to be quite a focus on Jerusalem. And I've given you a later manuscript image of how people imagined 12th century Jerusalem. Now, you'll all have heard of the Crusade. And this is a map of the Crusade of the Norwegian king Sigurd, which predates the Maeshowe inscriptions just by 30, 40 years. And it does appear that some of the people that carved Maeshowe inscriptions were either just returned from Jerusalem or were intending to travel to Jerusalem. We don't know really whether it was departure or return. Now, what we do know, there was King Sigurd's crusade, but that was a little bit too early. So it could have been Earl Rognvald's crusade, which fits exactly with the timing of the Maeshowe inscriptions. But again, we don't know. Did they really intend to crusade? Were they planning to fight, or was it more of a pilgrimage? When you read Orkney Saga, there isn't that much fighting going on. It's more like a sightseeing tour of the Middle East. And then there's the question, can you even call yourself a Jursalafari, a Jerusalem traveler, if you haven't been there yet, if you're just intending? I mean, you can't really call yourself a China traveler if you're just vaguely planning to travel to China in the next year or so. But we don't know if people at the time had a different view on that. So Jerusalem seems to have played a huge role in people's mind when they were carving inside Maeshowe. And indeed, at the time, it was the center of Christendom after its recapture by the Crusaders. Also, really helpfully, travel to Jerusalem and praying on certain sites promised an indulgence, so that meant you were spared so and so many years of purgatory for your sins. It's also interesting that the word Jorsala is spelled exactly the same in the two inscriptions. And we have that very rarely, that the same words are spelled exactly the same by two different carvers, because there wasn't an Oxford Dictionary of Old Norse or so at the time. So you just played it by ear normally. And if you have exactly the same spelling, that could indicate that the carvers may have seen the word written somewhere before. But of course, you can't prove that. But in any case, Jerusalem was perceived as the spiritual center of the world. In maps, it usually is at the center. But I just want to stress that does not mean that people thought it was literally the center of the world. There are good indications that the Norse in the 12th century were very well aware that the world was round and didn't think that physically Jerusalem was the center. But it was the spiritual center, and everyone thought of Jerusalem very often. So when it comes to religion more widely, of course, we have the Latin prayer from Nabisdale. We also have an inscription that says, Benedict carved this cross, and I have a picture of the cross here inside Maeshowe. Just across from Maeshowe on the ring of Brodgar, we also have an inscription, probably the name Björn, with a cross. We have an inscription in Orphir that talks about a church. We have two references to Jerusalem and Maeshowe. So a lot of openly Christian references, and not a single inscription that's definitely pagan. So this is very different to what a lot of people expect when they start looking at runes. And I think it's important to stress that at least for Orkney, runes were something that a lot of Christians carved, and we don't really know if there is one that's definitely pre-Christian at all. So when the Norse came to Orkney, what did they actually find? What did they think this place was? And how did they explain it? I mean, they did know standing stones, they did know mounds from their homeland. And interestingly, they carved runes on quite a lot of pre-existing monuments. So this is the ring of Brodgar, where I already said that, yes, we have an inscription there. We have Maeshowe, of course. So the Neolithic landscape was really reshaped, redefined, and used for carving. And it's not just because there was stone and that was convenient, because there would have been other places that are not Neolithic monuments that you could have carved on. But in a way, it also takes possession if you so publicly carve on the largest monuments that you find in the landscape. So it makes them Norse. It takes ownership of them. We also have one instance, the stone disc from Stackrue. That's a Pictish disc, and I've given you examples from Shetland and Port Mahomet of very similar looking Pictish discs. That was also carved with runes, and it has the word God and then some other difficult to interpret runes on there. So again, it seems to have been important to use a pre-used object to carve runes into it and to make it Norse. So in a way, we can actually say quite a lot about the carvers by looking at the inscriptions they made. Just to summarize a little bit, in most of the inscriptions that we can date are from the 12th century, so not from the very first settlement phase at all, but rather from a period when there was already a rising threat from Scotland. And it does appear that in some ways there is a very conscious use of the Norse heritage against this rising Scottish influence. So they make reference to Gauk Trandirson. They use Norway as their geographic point of reference, not Scotland. So it's very conscious. You don't do that by accident. It also appears that there are no genuine Orcadian innovations in these inscriptions. You can't pinpoint anything in these inscriptions, with the exception of mentioning a place name in Orkney, obviously, to say, yeah, this is definitely from Orkney. It could just as well be in Norway, if you look at the dialect, if you look at the rune forms. We have a lot of cipher runes, which unfortunately I just don't have the time to cover right now, which indicate a very high degree of literacy and also expecting a high degree of literacy from your reader. We don't have any influence of Gaelic in these inscriptions at all, and hardly any Latin. So really, Norse was the language that was most suitable for rune carving. So what was the world of Orcadian rune carvers like? Of course, these inscriptions can only offer us glimpses into their world. We'll never get the full picture. But there is a lot of focus on areas that are outside the immediate neighborhood. They don't just write about Caithness or so. I mean, there's Jerusalem, there's Norway, there's Iceland. So their world was really big and it was well connected across the sea. Orkney is not isolated at all, but it's part of a much wider sphere of Norse settlement across the sea. It's also considered part of wider medieval Christendom. People use biblical names, people carve crosses, people carve prayers. And really, people were way more literate than is often presumed. Also, I want to stress again, humor had a really prominent role. People carved actual jokes. And very often nowadays, we imagine the Middle Ages as this terribly dark, sad, grey time. But no, people really liked to have a laugh as well. And some of these inscriptions may have been politically motivated to claim ownership of the land. and to show allegiance to Norway as part of a wider cultural movement in the golden age of Norse Orkney. So, that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. I've given you my email address here. It's andrea.freund@uhi.ac.uk. So if you have any questions that come to mind after the Q&A, or if you really want to read the whole thing, or if you want advice on further reading, also at a level more suitable to beginners, I'm very happy to send you links or files. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. That was a fascinating talk and a fascinating journey through the evidence that exists in Orkney, and as I think you've shown to all of us, there is an enormous amount that can be gleaned from it, and it's really intriguing to compare it to the evidence of other places as well. In terms of questions, I know there's been a couple of messages of people on the side that have asked about the ability for their microphones, their cameras to be switched on in this program. Now, the setup here in this particular video conferencing program, in contrast to ones we've had in the past, is that audience participants don't have their microphones switched on and don't have the cameras switched on, but what there is a written question and answer function. Now, if you cannot already see it on the right hand of your screen, you should be able to find a blue circle with a speech bubble icon, either if you move your mouse if you're on a PC, or hopefully if you tap it with your on a touch screen kind of setup, and that should allow a Q&A column to open up on the right hand side, and if you can, you'll see a box which allows you to type a question, and if you select all panelists, that should be visible to all panelists. And I can see that quite a few questions have come through already, so thank you everybody who has done that so far. We will hopefully manage to get through a lot of them, but we've got, I think, a decent about half an hour anyway, so hopefully plenty of time. So I'll just take these in the order I have them just here. The first question, I don't know if you can see these as well, Andrea. What I think we've got here is you showed that there were Latin to rune works, or possibly words, no Gaelic to rune works. Also with the Crusades, there are likely to be green to rune works. That's a question. Is there any? So I think you said already that in Orkney there's not so much evidence of at least Gaelic names. I'm aware that there are evidence of Gaelic names in other Runic inscriptions. The Hunterston brooch, for example, which you showed briefly, it's got a Gaelic woman's name on it. Is there any evidence for either Gaelic words at all in Orkney, or indeed anything else, like Greek, for example, in any of the inscriptions?
So for Gaelic, we do indeed have inscriptions that have Gaelic names, not from Orkney or Shetland or Caithness, but interestingly from the Isle of Man, where we get this really wild mix of Gaelic and Norse names. And also the ornament is very much insular in style, but then you have runes on the crosses. So it's a completely different tradition, and there is much more mixing. And there we also know that the ruling dynasty was very much mixed. And the Isle of Man was never particularly loyal to the Norwegian crown, shall we say. So this may be one of the reasons, but there may be other reasons as well. And this is definitely something that should be investigated in more detail. Also looking at contact areas in the east of the Norse settlement. Only now people are starting to do really big excavations. I just read that someone claims to have found a Norse settlement area in Istanbul, and I personally would be very interested to see if there's any inscribed objects there or so. But so far I've only seen a news article. Now talking about Greek in runic inscriptions, we don't yet have any like a full sentence in Greek or so usually, but what we do get are devotional inscriptions, strangely even from Greenland, that use, for example, Greek names of the Lord and also Hebraic names of the Lord in a row, which when I saw the first one, I just couldn't figure out what language that was supposed to be until I realized it's tetragrammaton, so the Trinity, but in Greek. It does not appear that the people in Greenland who carved that knew Greek fluently, but rather this was a name that had a sacred meaning, so that's why it was carved. We do have inscriptions from Greece on the Piraeus lion statues that used to be in the harbor of Piraeus and that are now in Venice as they were plundered. We have 2 runic inscriptions on the paws and on the back of the lions. So if you ever make it to Venice, there are these 2 huge lion statues. You can still see the inscriptions, but they're pretty weathered by now.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you. It's always fascinating to see how interconnected the world was and how the North Atlantic world and its places like Iceland, Greenland, and how even tangentially they shared these cultural traits and exchanges with places, whether in the Byzantine world or elsewhere. Another question I've got here, going from languages to bears, because your talk was so wide-ranging, is a question which says, you mentioned that there are no other inscribed bear teeth from the Western Seas, but there were some from Norway. What can we say about those, dates, formula, etc., which might help us to understand the Birsay tooth?
I should have been clearer. We don't have any inscribed bear's teeth, as far as I know. But we do have bear's teeth that have a hole drilled in, as if they were worn on a necklace, maybe, from Scandinavia. And I was really surprised last year when I was teaching in Oslo. I went to the Norsk Folkemuseum, to the Sami exhibition, and there was a tooth that looked exactly like a Birsay tooth, with a hole in the same size and in the same position on the tooth in the Sami exhibition. But I have not done any in-depth research on the bear's teeth themselves. With Sami sites, the problem is that they're often very difficult, well, first of all, to locate, because they were nomadic people, but also they're very hard to date. So there are specialists on Sami archaeology, but I have not yet had any contact with one about bear's teeth in particular. But it is well possible that there is a connection across the sea with that. I have looked at the Birsay tooth, and it's definitely brown bear. It's not polar bear. So it's more likely to be from Scandinavia than, say, from Greenland or so.
Fascinating, thank you. There's loads of questions floating in now. I'll try and get through as many of them as possible. There's one question that I think ties into the same kind of themes of like the connectivity that you've been talking about before on how separate were the Normans from the Norse society in the 12th century? Would Orcadians be familiar with what was happening post 1066 and through the 12th century?
Well, when it comes to 1066 in particular, Orcadians would have been very, very familiar with events because if we believe written history, we don't have archaeological evidence for it, but Harald Hardrada, the Norwegian king, who also tried to conquer the English throne, traveled through Orkney before the Battle of, was it Stamford Bridge? Yeah. And left his family there. So a wife and daughter, probably, if we believe later written sources. And then the rest of Harald Hardrada's fleet after the defeat actually returned to Orkney with the body and then returned to Norway. So people in Orkney were at a crossroads of some of the most important sea routes at the time. So they were very well informed of what was going on. And also news traveled very well, not as quickly as today maybe, but still much quicker than we tend to assume.
Yes, indeed. And actually, the next question I've got there, I suppose, ties into that, but sort of looks at it from the other perspective. If Orkney was so connected and so clued up, if you like, about the rest of the world, how knowledgeable was the rest of the world about Orkney? I've got a question here that says that there's quite a few runestones in Sweden that mention England. Do any runestones in Scandinavia mention Orkney, to your knowledge? And if not, have you got any ideas why that might be?
To my knowledge, no runestone mentions Orkney or indeed Shetland. But the thing is that these runestones in Scandinavia, so we're talking about the big ornamental ones that were erected in memory of someone, usually just mention the country if someone was killed there and didn't return. It's very rarely that we have a country or a place named as this person went on a trading journey there or so. And also, most of them are from Sweden. We don't have that many from Norway, and it seems that Orkney always had a much closer connection to Norway, whereas the Swedes were much more orientated towards the east, so the river systems in modern-day Russia, but also England a little bit, and the north of what's now Germany. So we get more place names from the areas that these people went to and where these people died. So my guess would be, and I hope that not next week a runestone with Orkney turns up in Sweden. Although that would be fascinating. But, well, my guess is just because Norway doesn't have as many memorial stones in the first place, so it's not very likely to find one with Orkney and Shetland on, unfortunately.
That's a really interesting answer. Thank you, and hopefully that makes that seems to make a lot of sense. And you never know, do you? You never know what's going to turn up at some point. So who knows? Maybe we will have something like that turning up at Norway at some point. I've got another question here, which is asking if runes have always been understood, or in modern times did they have to be deciphered through a kind of, was there almost like a Rosetta Stone type eureka moment in modern times, or has there been continuous understanding of these things since they were actually written down in the medieval period?
We definitely never needed something like a Rosetta Stone, luckily. And the interesting thing about runes is that they were never completely forgotten. So we never really needed to re-decipher them completely. When the first Swedish Riksantikvarie, so shall we say Empire Antiquarian of Sweden, Bureus, Johann Bure, became interested in recording runestones and so on, he still found farmers in some valleys in Dalarna, Älvdalen especially, who used runes in their daily practice. And he could say, yeah, this is this, and this is this. And there was a real fashion in 17th century Sweden for recording runic inscriptions, and also for writing runic alphabets in big fancy manuscripts and so on. So luckily, it was never completely forgotten. Of course, it still is a journey of rediscovery, but it's much easier than hieroglyphs, I would say.
Thank you. Yes, it's always fascinating to see sort of antiquarian engagement with this kind of stuff, and the way that people's understanding of the past has changed to reflect trends in culture at the time. I've got a question here saying you mentioned double stave carving as a more decorative style. Do you find any runic inscriptions that are accompanied by explicit decoration or imagery or iconography? Yeah,
we even have a range of different runestone styles, which were most prominent in Sweden. In the area around what is now Stockholm and Uppsala, we have thousands of runestones, and they have a very distinctive iconography that ties in with Viking Age art styles more in general, which helps us in dating them a lot. And there are a lot of images of runestones. For instance, if you go to Wikipedia, and they are curated by people that work for the Swedish Heritage Board, so the collection of images is really good. And if you look at the Wikipedia page for runestone styles, you can see the different ones, and they're really so distinctive. The heads of the animals, just by looking at the eyes and the ears, you can give a period of about 20 years into which a runestone belongs. Unfortunately, in Orkney, we don't have that, because the runestones that are surviving are fragmented. Also, weathering, if you've ever been to Orkney, you'll understand that weathering is a really bad problem. Wind and rain and cold, and doesn't do the stones any good. But we don't really have one where you could even suspect that it must have had elaborate decorations.
Thank you. Another question, going back to this question of literacy and the extent to which it would have been widespread or not. I've got, did enough people understand them for them to be potentially used as public notices ever, do you think? We don't really have good examples from Orkney that would have been public notices like I so-and-so inherit this and this. But there's actually a theory that runestones in Sweden were partly used as public inheritance documents, because they always say who erected the stone and who died. And it's possible that it was a convention that whoever inherited from the deceased had to raise a runestone to make this claim. And interestingly, the runestones in Sweden are often found at waterways and at crossroads, so that as many people as possible would see this. It probably wasn't the only function, but in a way, they were almost like public notices. Yeah. We also have the, as I already said, when Orkney sided with the wrong pretender to the Norwegian crown in the 12th century. I'm really bad. The guy who lost, a Sigurd, actually carved a long and very angry runic inscription on a church portal in Norway before fleeing, and saying that this person who now pretends to be king is horrible, and this person killed my father, and I'll never give up. So that was another very public notice. Public notice only makes sense if your target group, so churchgoers in that district, can read really well. That's fascinating. Another example, I think, that just really, it makes them so human as well.
Yeah.
It's like this bone wasn't meat, kind of in a very different way. It's just it's one of these things that people really haven't changed, whether that's a terrible sense of humour or kind of anger or rage or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, there's also an inscription in Maeshowe that you basically have to climb a ladder to read, and then all it says is that someone carved these runes high up. And you just climb your ladder and you go like, oh, come on, really? But actually, this is probably the intended effect of the joke.
Yeah, it's fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. I've got another question here. Why do you think that there are so few runic inscriptions found in England? And of the ones that have been found, what is their distribution?
No, I'm by no means a specialist on England or on the Viking Age in England so much. But the inscriptions there tend to be earlier than the Orkney ones. If we look at when runic inscriptions really took up in Orkney, that's actually after the Viking Age, long after 1066. We're in the mid-12th century in Orkney, and the Bergen inscriptions and so on, they are also post-dating the Viking Age mostly. So by that time, England was Norman. By that time, runes wouldn't have been used anymore in England. So it seems that, the Normans prevented more English runic inscriptions from existing. But what Earl, of course, has is plenty of Anglo-Saxon runic inscriptions that I haven't covered in my talk now at all.
Yeah, it's always tricky, I suppose, to kind of engage with the situation in different places when the situation might be so different. Another question relates to the question of survival, which is, of course, something else that's another factor in different places. And is there any way of knowing or perhaps estimating approximately what proportion of inscriptions might be missing due to the preservation of material? For example, is it expected that many more were written on wood and leather that haven't survived?
It's a very difficult question to answer. Well, there have been some estimates for other areas. We don't have an estimate for Orkney at the moment. But if we compare with Greenland, for instance, where over 90% of all inscriptions are in wood, and they only survive due to the permafrost, and they're being found now because, well, it melts. And if we compare with Bergen, where we have hundreds and hundreds on wood, it could be. There were some estimates that at the moment, in talking about all runic inscriptions in general, the 6,000 we have may only be 10% maybe, but we can't say whether in Orkney 10% survived or 20%. Unfortunately, I can't give you a number, but if you are in Orkney or Shetland for that matter, go through life with open eyes on the beach. If you see a stone with strange scratches, it may be runes.
Good advice. It's one of these things that if you don't look out for something, you'll never find it, even if it's there just right below your feet. I've got a question here. Factoring out the dominance of Maeshowe, any thoughts on the reasons for the much larger number of inscriptions in Orkney versus Shetland?
That may be a question of maybe power balance, because within the Earldom of Orkney, Orkney itself was the seat of the Earls, so the most powerful people would reside with the Earl, because in order to ascertain your status, you always had to be friends with the Earl, you had to be in the kind of good books, so you had to make appearances there. Now the bones in Earl's Woo, for instance, for which we have nothing comparable in Shetland, do appear to have been carved as a part of feasting. And feasting is something that would have been done in the presence of the Earl. And this is maybe something that didn't happen so much in Shetland. Or preservation may be even worse in Shetland than it is in Orkney. I mean, the one major Norse site that has been excavated is the Jarl's Hof in Shetland. But that was, shall we say, not done doing the most modern methods. So if there were small inscribed bone pieces or metal pieces, they may have been lost. But because it's a Victorian excavation at the time, they were not that interested in bone pieces or so. It's also possible that at some of the earlier excavations in Orkney, inscriptions were lost, and we just have no record of them.
Thank you. And another question on the relationships between different places geographically I've got here. Is there any indication that the runes had links with Ireland, taking into account the fact that the Vikings had such an influence in Ireland?
We do have some runic inscriptions from Ireland, mostly from Dublin as far as I know, because there they have this nice waterlogged mud that preserves inscriptions really well when they're on organic material. But not that many. I think we have one major runestone from Ireland, but not as much. But then the Norse history in Ireland was really, they could never really establish themselves in the hinterland as much. I mean, Orkney was completely dominated by the Norse. And in Ireland, that never really happened so much. They were driven out again, and then they returned again. So maybe not an environment that was so conducive to high literacy or carving jokes or so. But again, the preservation situation is very different. And also society in Ireland appears to have been much more hybrid. In Ireland, you never had to demonstrate by using a public Norse script that you were extremely loyal to the Norwegian crown. In fact, it was maybe even better for you politically if you were not seen as a direct ally to the Norwegian crown. So there's a lot of factors that would have played into that.
Thank you. Yes, and again, I suppose so much room for speculation and kind of wondering, well, why is this the case one place and not the case elsewhere. Talking about, I've got a question here asking, just to clarify, was the person who carved the criticism of the Norwegian king at the Norwegian kirk from Orkney?
Do you mean
the one that you were talking about that's just carved the sort of angry message on the
church portal? No,
yes.
He was Norwegian.
He was Norwegian, yes.
The problem was that the Orcadian Earls had to take sides. They took his side and he lost. So that was a bit unfortunate for the fate of Orkney, because after that they were not allowed to keep the tax money from Shetland anymore, and the tax money from Shetland then went directly to the new Norwegian king. So the Earls became much poorer.
Yes, indeed. So very much an Orkney connection with that, but not as directly as the message being carved. I mean, the questions are still piling in. I'm aware that we're running out of time now, so I'll just ask a couple more. Thank you very much, everyone. I will say as well, would it be possible, Andrea, for you to share a slide again with your email address? Because there's been quite a number of messages asking for further information or things, or to have the...
I can just type it into the chat, the Q&A chat window.
Okay, and hopefully people will be able to see that if you share it with...
I'm wondering if you can see it now. Oh, it won't actually let me send. Is the chat public?
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is. No.
Okay, I'll try and see if I can share my final slide again.
Thank you. And can I ask anybody who's messaged on the chat asking if they can have either further information or information on the, or who wants a copy of the slides or anything, could you please email Andrea to ask for a copy of the slides directly? Thank you, because I don't think we have it. We won't have any way of necessarily responding and passing that on to you if you've just messaged through the chat function. So if you could contact Andrea directly, and if Andrea doesn't mind just leaving this up for the last 5 minutes or so, that would be wonderful, so everybody can have a chance to take down that email address. I've got a practical question here. You touched on the fact that at least one of the inscriptions that said that it was inscribed with famous acts probably wasn't. How would runes on stone have been inscribed? Would it have been with a sort of chisel?
Well, it really depends on the material that you carve on. So for Sweden, for instance, we have very good data and a lot of research. People have laser scanned runestones in 3D. And that appears that the kind of big official monuments were usually chiseled, so with a chisel and a hammer. But in Orkney, the inscriptions look very different. They appear to, for instance, the Maeshowe one, have been carved with a sharp tool because you'd use it for eating, well, and sometimes for defending yourself, but mostly for eating officially. So they could have been carved with a knife, and we have some inscriptions that are really, really faint in sandstone. It's enough to use your fingernail to carve in the Orcadian type of really soft sandstone. So it always depends very much on the material you have. If you look at the bear's tooth, they were cut with a very sharp instrument, and then kind of black powder was rubbed into the carving to make the carving more prominent. I'm not sure if the powder has ever been analyzed, whether it's ash or something like that, but that could be. So the techniques really vary depending on what material you're writing on and also how much time you have, because chiseling out a runestone takes a while, whereas if you have a knife and soft sandstone, it's really almost as quick as writing with pen and paper nowadays.
Thank you. And I think we've got time for one final question. Sorry for anyone that we didn't get to your question, but thank you for sending so many of them. I've got the question here: do we know how runes were learned during the Viking Age? There's clearly quite a lot of phonetic variation in their use. Does this suggest that there was no real consensus about the sounds which attached to them?
Well, there was some consensus. because we generally have a relatively good idea. But even nowadays, someone from London will pronounce the same written word differently than someone from Orkney. Just talk about the letter R, for instance. And there was obviously variation between different speakers, between different areas in Old Norse just as well. I mean, we're talking about a huge area ranging from the Varangians in Istanbul to Greenland, and for a while even the coast of America. So there was variety. Now, in terms of for the actual practical learning of runes, we have some examples of sticks or bones with the entire rune roll. And we have some instances of small bone pieces, wood pieces or so, or sometimes bedrock and so on, where people just carve their names. And usually either the row of a writing system, so nowadays the alphabet, and your own name is the very first thing you learn to write. So it's possible that these, or some of these people at least, were learners who just started out. Even inside Maeshowe, we have a pair of inscriptions. One says Sigr, and the other says Sigridr. So it appears that one is a failed and aborted attempt of writing the name Sigrid, and the second one is the successful attempt. So it is well possible that some people were not the strongest at spelling or so, and some people were learning as they went along.
Again, that's just really interesting to hear, and again, it makes it more, all the more human, really, doesn't it? It's everybody's not perfect, yep. And not everyone is the most skilled rune carver this side of the Western Sea, even if they might like to think that they were. Well, I think that brings us to the end today. Thank you very much, Andrea, for an absolutely fascinating talk, and for your equally fascinating answers to a whole range of different questions. And thank you very much, everybody who's been attending. First of all, for your attendance and your attention. I hope you enjoyed it, and also for all of the fascinating questions as well. So I hope you have a lovely rest of the day, whatever you're doing, and hope to see you at another event soon. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and thanks everybody for listening and for interesting questions. As I said, I'll be very happy to respond to emails as well. Bye-bye.